On a Wednesday morning in Springfield, Missouri, a woman named Marlene Ashcroft sat at her kitchen table doing something most widows do not do, 9 days after burying a husband. She was not crying. She was not holding the folded flag from his Rotary Club memorial, and she was not rereading the sympathy cards still arriving in stacks of 4 and 5 a day. She was running numbers, because the man she had buried the week before, Walter Ashcroft, had left behind a company in far worse condition than his obituary had suggested. And Marlene, who had built her own firm from a single office cleaning contract into a business managing properties across 4 counties, intended to fix it quietly, the way she fixed everything. What she did not know yet was that fixing Walter's mess would mean meeting a version of her husband she had never encountered. A man with a second address, a second calendar, and, before the coffee in her cup went cold, a woman on her front porch who believed she had buried the same husband first. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 2 people stood at the center of what was about to come apart. Walter Ashcroft had inherited Ashcroft Industrial Holdings from his father 2 decades earlier, a company built on regional maintenance contracts that once meant something in Springfield. Marlene Ashcroft was the wife who had spent 14 years building her own success beside him, never fully inside his side of the ledger, because his father had structured the business that way long before Marlene ever wore the family name. From the outside, their marriage had looked like the kind small towns pointed to as proof that steady work and mutual respect could outlast almost anything life put in front of it. But 3 questions were about to surface that no eulogy had prepared anyone for. Where had Walter's company's money actually gone for the better part of a decade? Who was the woman about to park an Oklahoma-plated sedan in Marlene's driveway with a folder under her arm? And what exactly had Walter promised that woman that he never delivered to the wife who buried him? Marlene had not been born into any of it. She grew up the daughter of a school custodian in Joplin, and by 26, she was cleaning offices herself on nights and weekends, underbidding contracts other companies considered beneath their attention. What she considered beneath her attention was excuses. By 31, she had incorporated Ashcroft Commercial Services. Her name already carried Walter's by then, though the company was entirely hers. And by 45, she was managing janitorial, grounds, and light maintenance contracts for school districts and municipal buildings in 4 counties. She built it the way she built everything, through reliability rather than charm, and she trusted that same instinct completely, which was part of why what came later cut as deep as it did. Walter had inherited something different. Ashcroft Industrial Holdings had belonged to his father, a company doing structural and equipment maintenance for warehouses and light manufacturing plants scattered around southwest Missouri. Walter took it over at 34, back when it was profitable enough that nobody asked hard questions, and he ran it the way his father had taught him, through relationships, handshake extensions, and a belief that a man of his family's standing did not need to explain his numbers to anyone, including his wife. From the earliest years of their marriage, the 2 companies operated on separate accountants, separate banks, separate everything. Marlene handled her business. Walter handled his. They discussed broad strokes over dinner, the way 2 working spouses do, and for a long time that arrangement felt like respect rather than distance. Looking back, Marlene could trace the shift with uncomfortable clarity. Small comments about delayed vendor payments, frustration over an equipment lease he called temporary, a tax reassessment he waved off as bureaucratic nonsense. None of it, taken alone, was dramatic enough to justify Marlene forcing her way into a company that was not legally hers to examine, not when she was already running 31 employees and a dozen contracts of her own. There were trips, too, that she eventually stopped asking about because the answers grew thinner each year. A maintenance conference in Tulsa that recurred with unusual regularity, a supplier relationship he called complicated, A phone that stayed face down on the counter more often after year 11 of their marriage than it ever had before. She had believed, right up until the funeral, that whatever had changed between them was ordinary marital erosion, the kind two people work through privately, because walking away costs more than staying does. She had decided, somewhere in the exhausted, grief-fogged days after the service, that she would absorb whatever financial mess Walter left behind using her own company's reserves, because that was the kind of woman her mother had raised her to be. You did not set down responsibility because it arrived wearing someone else's name. She had no idea, sitting at that kitchen table with her legal pad and her calculator, that the responsibility she was preparing to absorb had a face, a name, and a 6-year-old son who would be standing in her driveway before the week was finished. Their marriage had not always felt like distance. Marlene could still remember the early years clearly, before the trips to Tulsa multiplied and the excuses grew polished, when Walter used to drive out to whatever job site she was inspecting just to bring her lunch, when he still asked how her contracts were going and actually listened to the answer. Somewhere around year 11, something in him had quietly rearranged itself, and she had chalked it up at the time to the ordinary weight of 2 demanding businesses and 2 tired people trying to hold a household together. She had never once considered that the weight pulling him away from her had a name, an address, and, eventually, a son who would grow up believing his father belonged to him first. That was the piece she would spend the rest of this story trying to make peace with. Not the debt, not even the deception, but the years she had spent defending a version of her marriage that had already stopped being true. The car that turned into Marlene's driveway that Wednesday morning did not belong to anyone she expected. It was not Faye Renwick, who had already delivered enough church casseroles to last a month. It was not her accountant, who was not due until Thursday. The engine idled a moment too long before it shut off, the particular pause of someone gathering themselves before they do something they have rehearsed. Marlene set down her pen and walked to the front window. A woman stood in the driveway in a structured ivory coat, her hair pulled back with the kind of precision that takes practice in front of a mirror. Beside her stood a small boy, maybe 6 years old, holding her hand but staring past her, directly at the house, with an expression that stopped something in Marlene's chest before she could stop it herself. The boy had Walter's eyes, not a passing resemblance, the exact shape, the exact stillness. Marlene opened the door before the woman could knock. The woman spoke first, evenly, like a line she had practiced in the car the whole drive from Oklahoma. "My name is Bethany Wren. I was Walter's wife. This is our son, Caleb. Not his girlfriend, not the mother of his child. His wife," delivered the way a person states something they believe they have every right to say, with a thin folder tucked under one arm that looked thick enough to have been assembled over years rather than days. Marlene held the door a moment longer than she needed to, taking in the folder, the boy's face, the woman's rehearsed calm. Then she said the only thing that made sense to say, "You'd better come in." Not because she wanted this woman inside her house 9 days after a funeral, but because a person who drives 400 miles with a prepared child and a prepared folder is not someone you turn away from your porch. You let her sit down. You let her say every single word she came to say, because you need to know exactly what you are dealing with before you decide how to respond to it. Bethany chose the chair across from the sofa rather than the sofa itself, positioning herself facing the room with her back to the wall, the choice of someone who had thought about where to sit before she ever arrived. Caleb sat beside her, quiet, his eyes moving across the room and landing on a framed photograph of Walter from a company event 3 years earlier. He stared at it a beat longer than everything else in the room, and neither adult acknowledged what that meant. "I know this isn't easy," Bethany said, opening the folder at last. "But Caleb is Walter's son, and we have rights." The word rights landed differently than wife had. Wife was a claim about her. Rights was a claim about everything Marlene had spent 30 years building. She laid out photographs one by one. Walter at what looked like a modest backyard ceremony. Younger, in a suit Marlene had never seen, standing beside Bethany in a plain cream dress, under strings of porch lights. A folded program with both their names printed on the front. 4 letters in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. The hard downward press he put on every stroke, addressed to an apartment outside Tulsa. Marlene did not need to read them. The handwriting alone told her everything. "Did he tell you about me?" Marlene asked quietly. Bethany didn't hesitate, which was its own kind of answer. "He said you were the one he couldn't leave. Not because he loved you, because leaving would have cost him the business and the family name. He said the marriage had been over in everything but paperwork for years." She said it cleanly, without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder, because she wasn't trying to wound Marlene. She was simply repeating what she had been told and had believed for 9 years. Walter had built Marlene into a character in someone else's story. The cold wife, the obstacle, the woman who justified every choice he made 350 miles away. Marlene asked. 9 years. Caleb just turned 6. Bethany slid one final document across the coffee table. A marriage certificate, her name and Walter's name. A notary seal in the corner, dated 11 years into Marlene's own marriage. The room went very still. Even Caleb seemed to feel it, looking down at his hands, the way children do when the air in a room changes, and they don't yet have words for why. "You believe this was legal," Marlene said, not quite a question. "He told me his divorce had already gone through before we met. Quiet, handled privately because of the business and the family name." Bethany's composure cracked slightly at the edges now. "I asked questions at first, then years passed, and eventually I stopped looking for reasons not to believe the man I was building a life with." That admission cost Marlene something she had not expected. Not forgiveness, but a flicker of recognition. Walter had not maintained 2 lives through brilliance. He had maintained them through distance, selective truth, and the ordinary human instinct to trust the explanations that protect the future you have already committed yourself to. Bethany gathered her documents the way she had laid them out, methodically, and stood. Caleb stood with her, glancing once more at Marlene before they moved toward the door. Marlene walked them out and stood on the porch until the Oklahoma plates disappeared at the end of the street. Then she went back inside, sat down at the same kitchen table, and stared at the financial records she had spent all night organizing. Records that suddenly looked less like recklessness and more like a schedule she had not yet learned to read. Marlene called Harold Voss before the coffee in her cup had gone fully cold. He had been her attorney for 12 years, and she trusted him precisely because he never told her what she wanted to hear. He told her to come to his office at 8 the next morning, to say nothing to Bethany if she reached out again, and to move nothing, no money, no documents, before they had a plan. Marlene spent the rest of that night at her kitchen table, not paralyzed, but working, pulling every irregular withdrawal from Walter's business accounts into a single column on her legal pad. A pattern emerged almost immediately. Transfers every 4 to 6 weeks, modest amounts, larger around the holidays and the start of the school year. Not reckless spending, maintenance. 9 years, possibly more, of quietly financing a second household through accounts Walter controlled entirely on his own. Harold's office occupied the 14th floor of a downtown building that had his name on the directory and nothing unnecessary on the walls. He had 2 folders waiting when Marlene arrived. "The marriage certificate she presented isn't legally valid," he said without preamble. "Walter never filed for divorce from you. Not in Missouri, not in Oklahoma, not anywhere I can find a record. What Bethany Wren has is a ceremony, a program, and photographs. None of it creates lawful spousal standing, because the man standing beside her was already legally married to you." He opened the second folder. "The boy is different. A biological connection gives Caleb potential standing as an heir, if paternity is established. But inheritance rights only attach to whatever remains of Walter's actual estate after obligations, and based on what you've handed me, that's considerably less than she believes." He walked her through it with no theatrics, only numbers. 3 active creditor claims already filed against Ashcroft Industrial Holdings, an IRS obligation that had been accumulating penalties for nearly 2 years, while Walter filed extensions he never followed through on. An equipment lease default on vehicles the company no longer even operated, and liens on 2 properties that now carried debt exceeding their assessed value. "You can fight this on every front and win," Harold said. "Her standing as a spouse doesn't exist. The child's claim is real, but financially limited, because the estate itself is distressed." Marlene looked at the numbers for a long moment before asking the question she had actually come to ask. "What happens if I don't fight it? If I let them pursue the estate instead of blocking them?" Harold went still, recalculating in real time. "If a beneficiary knowingly accepts a distressed estate," he said slowly, "they accept the obligations attached to it too. The creditor claims transfer. The tax exposure transfers. The liens transfer. Debt doesn't disappear because ownership changes hands." Marlene nodded once, filing the answer away without explaining what she intended to do with it. The story reached the local paper faster than either of them expected. Bethany's attorney, a Tulsa-based lawyer named Preston Lockhart, filed a probate claim built almost entirely around Caleb. Language like rightful heir and a child left without his father appeared in the first paragraph. Walter's name always followed by the phrase, "Caleb's father, never husband." Lockhart understood exactly what he was doing. A child at the center of a filing changes the emotional temperature of a courtroom before anyone reaches the financial pages, and Walter's family name had carried enough local weight for the story to travel. Within a day, a Springfield business outlet ran the filing as a story, and by the second share, it had stopped being a probate document and become something people had opinions about. Marlene read every version of it at her own office, the one place that still felt entirely hers. She thought about Caleb sitting at her table, staring at his father's photograph a second longer than everything else. A 6-year-old boy who had lost his father and had no understanding of what the adults around him were building in his name. Bethany was not wrong that her grief and her son's biology were real. She was simply using real things for calculated purposes and calling it justice, and Marlene understood the difference without needing to hate her for it. Then Harold called with something else. A woman named Dana Iverson had contacted his office. Not Bethany, someone else entirely. She said she had also been involved with Walter for nearly 4 years, and that he had presented himself to her as a man separated in every way but paperwork. She did not want money. She said she had messages, financial records, and travel confirmations, and that some of the transfers she remembered overlapped with the irregularities Marlene had already flagged. A second woman did not devastate Marlene the way the first had. It settled over her like a stone in still water. Heavy, but not destabilizing, because she had already redrawn her understanding of who Walter was. A second woman only confirmed the shape of a pattern already mapped. Marlene met Dana at a coffee shop on the south side of town. Neutral ground, Dana's suggestion. She had been involved with Walter through a professional contact tied to commercial property management, and he had told her the same story he apparently told everyone. A wife who cared more about contracts than connection. A marriage that had ended emotionally years before it ended on paper. "He used my name," Marlene said quietly, and Dana nodded, not defensively, just honestly. 3 months before Walter died, Dana said, he had grown nervous about money, watching his phone constantly, complaining about vendor pressure. Once, only once, he had said something that stayed with her. "If Marlene ever sees the full books, she'll walk." Dana slid an envelope across the table. Travel confirmations, screenshots of transfers sent during periods Walter had claimed he was waiting on delayed payments, dates that lined up precisely with the irregular withdrawals Marlene had already found. Not scandal, continuity. A pattern connecting emotional deception directly to financial concealment. And patterns matter in courtrooms because patterns suggest intent. Before Dana ever came forward, Marlene and Harold had spent the better part of a week chasing a different explanation entirely, one that made more sense on paper and turned out to mean nothing at all. A former operations partner named Roger Callum had left Ashcroft Industrial Holdings under strained circumstances 2 years earlier, and for a few days, Harold's staff treated him as the likeliest source of the missing funds, a disgruntled former partner siphoning money on his way out the door. It took 3 days of bank subpoenas to rule him out completely. 3 days Marlene spent bracing for a different kind of betrayal, a business one instead of a personal one. When Callum's accounts came back clean, it only sharpened what remained, because it meant the transfers had never been a partner's scheme or an employee's theft. They were Walter's, deliberate and sustained, moved by his own hand every 4 to 6 weeks for nearly a decade. Marlene's friend Faye Renwick had known her since she was 23, had sat in the front pew at her wedding, had brought food to the house after the funeral without being asked. She showed up at the kitchen table 8 days after Bethany first knocked, folded her hands, and said what half the town was apparently already saying. "People think you've given up, that you're letting that woman walk away with everything Walter left you." Marlene told her the truth, without telling her the plan, that Harold had everything he needed, because the strategy required total silence, and she could not risk it leaking before the hearing. Faye left unconvinced but loyal, the specific weight of being loved by someone you cannot yet tell the truth. She called twice more that week, each time gentler than the last, and each time Marlene gave her the same steady answer, because the only thing worse than losing this fight quietly would have been winning it loudly before it was finished. 3 nights before the hearing, Marlene sat in her office, going through the last banker's box of Walter's personal records, the ones Harold had returned after discovery review. Near the bottom, folded into a file marked personal, she found a single bank statement for an account she had never seen in any disclosure, any accounting review, or any conversation in 14 years of marriage. The balance was modest, not hidden wealth, just enough to make her sit down properly. The account carried only her name, not joint, not trust-linked. Hers alone, opened 11 years earlier, with irregular contributions over roughly 7 years. Small deposits around anniversaries, 2 within weeks of her mother's funeral. Another the year she expanded into her 3rd county. The deposits stopped 4 years ago and had sat untouched since, gathering quiet interest. She held the statement under her desk lamp for a long time. Procedurally, it changed nothing. Her name alone meant probate would never touch it. Emotionally, it complicated everything she had already settled in her mind. At some point, for reasons she would never fully access, Walter had quietly set something aside for her. Not enough to redeem him, not enough to outweigh Tulsa, or Bethany, or Caleb, or 9 years of concealment. Simple villains are easy to bury. Real people leave fragments behind that refuse to fit together cleanly, and Marlene decided, after 20 minutes of trying, that she was not going to force those fragments into a shape that made sense. Some people die before they become understandable. She went back through the deposit dates one more time before she closed the file, looking for a pattern the way she had looked for one in every other account Walter left behind. There was no pattern here, only scattered moments, an anniversary, a hard year, a milestone in her own business he had apparently noticed even when he said very little about it out loud. One deposit landed the same month she signed the contract that carried Ashcroft Commercial Services into its 3rd county, a fact she was certain Walter had never mentioned to her at the time, though the timing was too precise to be coincidence. She did not know whether to call it love, guilt, or some private accounting of his own that she would never be permitted to see the ledger for. She decided it did not matter which one it was. It changed nothing about what she owed Bethany, or Caleb, or the truth, and it changed nothing about what Walter owed her, which was considerably more than one quiet account could repay. She wrote her plan the same night, in the same operational style she ran her business. No unnecessary language, every step in order, and sent it to Harold before sunrise. He read it without calling, sitting with the full structure before reacting to any single piece. When he finally called the next morning, his voice carried the particular flatness of a man recalculating assumptions he no longer trusted. "Come in," he said. She walked him through it, standing in his office. The estate transfer would acknowledge Caleb directly, not Bethany. His biological connection was the only legally supportable claim, and Marlene intended to recognize it voluntarily before the court forced the issue, which would read as cooperation rather than obstruction. Because Caleb was a minor, no transfer could finalize without an independently appointed guardian ad litem, someone whose legal obligation ran to the child alone, and the estate disclosure would stay attached in full from the start. Every lien, every creditor claim, every IRS obligation, entering the record simultaneously with the transfer proposal. Nothing hidden, nothing withheld. Harold read through the plan a second time before he spoke again, checking it the way he checked every contract that crossed his desk, looking for the fracture point opposing counsel might use to unwind it later. "This is legally executable," he said finally. "The disclosure structure is compliant. The guardian requirement protects the court procedurally. The transfer proposal itself is clean." He set the pages down. "But you understand there are risks. If Lockhart requests extended forensic review before acceptance, this slows down considerably." "He won't," Marlene said. "Not at first. You sound certain. He's already gone public. Statements to a reporter, photographs on courthouse steps. A man in that position doesn't request a delay before he understands he needs one. The important part is timing," Marlene said. "Lockhart is fighting this like a beneficiary recognition case first and a liability review second. He's building momentum around Caleb before the numbers slow him down. By the time he pivots into asset versus liability analysis, he'll have already committed publicly to the idea that this estate is worth pursuing aggressively." Harold studied her for a long moment. "You understand something else," he said finally. "Once this enters motion, there's no returning to your original position. Whatever survives after creditor administration, if anything does, stops belonging to you." Marlene nodded. "I know. And if Bethany realizes what the estate actually is before she's fully committed, she'll spend the rest of the hearing trying to walk back statements she's already made to a reporter." Harold said nothing for a while. Then, for the first time since Walter died, he looked at her not as a grieving widow, but as a strategist, and neither of them corrected the impression. Marlene dressed for the hearing in charcoal trousers and a deep green blouse, not black. The black dress stayed in the closet. She arrived at the Greene County Courthouse 40 minutes early and sat on a bench outside the assigned courtroom with nothing beside her. No briefcase, no notes, no performance arranged for strangers. At 9:27, she heard Bethany's group before she saw them. Coordinated footsteps, a rolling briefcase, the pace of people who believe momentum already belongs to them. Bethany wore a structured ivory coat. Caleb walked beside her in a pressed dark jacket. Lockhart followed half a step behind, carrying 2 banker's boxes and a legal pad already divided into sections, which told Marlene he had at least skimmed the disclosures, even if he did not yet understand their scale. Bethany saw her and held her gaze for 2 full seconds before turning forward again. 2 women connected permanently by a man no longer alive to explain himself. Inside, Judge Corinne Ashby reviewed the transfer packet without visible reaction and confirmed the terms allowed for the record. Provisional inheritance, standing for Caleb pending verification. Full disclosure of debt schedules and creditor claims attached per probate procedure. Guardian ad litem oversight before any transfer could finalize. She asked Lockhart directly whether his side had received the complete disclosure package. Creditor actions, tax exposure, liens, supplemental accounting. "We have, Your Honor," Lockhart answered, still confident, still operating as though he understood the difference between a distressed estate and an estate with almost no protected value left underneath the distress. He did not yet know which one this was. Marlene signed the transfer documents without rushing, her full legal name on each line, the same signature she had used on contracts that built everything she actually owned. She could feel Bethany watching her hand, sitting slightly forward, fingers folded, wearing the composure of a woman who had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Judge Ashby passed the acceptance materials to Lockhart for review and provisional countersignature. He opened the packet with the confidence of a man entering the final stage of a victory he believed had already been secured. Until he reached the creditor schedules, the IRS penalty accumulation, the equipment defaults, the liens exceeding property value, and finally the certified public record search, confirming no divorce had ever been filed in any jurisdiction between Walter and Marlene. His pen stopped moving. He looked at the numbers, then at the certified record, then slowly at Bethany, whose smile had already disappeared, replaced by the careful blankness of someone trying to decide whether panic was justified before letting it show. Judge Ashby asked whether the receiving party wished to request additional review time before countersignature and guardian scheduling. Lockhart hesitated, which told Marlene everything. The problem was no longer legal misunderstanding, but procedural momentum, public filings, and press statements made weeks before anyone had completed a full liability review. Bethany said his name once, quietly, then again, sharper. Marlene stood, gathered nothing because there was nothing left to carry, and walked out at an unhurried pace. She did not turn around. Somewhere behind her, real consequences were beginning to arrive the way they almost always do. Not dramatically, but in letters, filings, and revised expectations. Probate administration would continue for months after that morning. Creditor review, guardian assessment, an asset evaluation that would eventually confirm, in plain administrative language, what Harold had already told her weeks earlier. Whatever remained of Ashcroft Industrial Holdings after its obligations were satisfied would be modest at best, and any of it that reached Caleb would arrive filtered through a guardian whose only responsibility was protecting a 6-year-old boy from the ambitions of the adults around him. Marlene did not take pleasure in imagining Bethany sitting with those numbers for the first time, alone, away from cameras and courtroom benches. She simply let it happen at the distance it deserved. She thought instead of Caleb, of the way he had looked at his father's photograph, a second longer than anything else in her living room, and she hoped the guardian appointed to represent him turned out to be the kind of adult whose loyalty belonged to him alone, something his mother's calculations and his father's silence had both, in their own ways, failed to provide. Caleb would have a court-appointed guardian whose only loyalty ran to him, which was, in the end, more than Marlene could have given him herself, and more than his mother's ambition had left room for. Marlene drove straight to her own office, not home, because home no longer felt like the right place to sit with what had just happened. She parked in her usual spot, nodded to her operations manager at the front desk, and closed her office door behind her. She sat behind the desk she had earned entirely on her own, the same desk where she had reviewed quarterly reports and signed payroll, and built an expansion plan county by county without a single dollar of inheritance carrying her there. She opened the top drawer and looked once more at the small bank statement with only her name on it, then closed the drawer again, because she had already decided it did not need an answer today. 3 client meetings waited for her the following week. A contract renewal she had been delaying since September sat in a folder marked Next Quarter, alongside an expansion proposal for 2 additional counties that 8 months of grief and legal maneuvering had put on hold. Outside her window, Springfield moved through an ordinary Friday afternoon, entirely unaware of what had just shifted inside a Greene County courtroom. Life rarely pauses because a marriage collapses in public. Walter had left behind debt, disguised as legacy, and a version of himself Marlene would never fully untangle, and she understood, finally, sitting behind that desk, the difference between owning something and merely inheriting the illusion of it. Marlene Ashcroft never took Walter Ashcroft's collapsing business as her own burden to rebuild, and she never destroyed a 6-year-old boy to punish the mother who had raised him inside someone else's lie. She let the paperwork tell the truth her husband spent 9 years hiding, and she walked away owning exactly what she had always owned: her own name, her own company, and a company town's understanding that she had never needed rescuing in the first place. What would you have done in Marlene's position? Fought for every dollar of an inheritance, or let a 6-year-old boy have whatever was left once the truth came out? Tell us in the comments, because stories like this one only stay hidden as long as nobody's willing to ask the hard questions out loud. And we suspect a lot of you have asked them before. If this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting for you next week. A woman who spent 30 years running a family catering business, only to discover, the week she planned to retire, that the man who inherited it beside her had already signed it away to someone else entirely. If you want to make sure you don't miss it, go ahead and tap that subscribe button now, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you the moment it drops. We'll see you there.